Chapter 11. The Mooncalf Pastures. So we two poor terrestrial castaways, lost in that wild-growing moon jungle, crawled in terror before the sounds that had come upon us. We crawled, as it seemed, a long time before we saw either selenite or mooncalf, though we heard the bellowing and gruntulous noises of these latter continually drawing nearer to us. We crawled through stony ravines, over snow slopes, amidst fungi that ripped like thin bladders at our thrust, emitting a watery humor, over a perfect pavement of things like puffballs, and beneath interminable thickets of scrub. And ever more helplessly our eyes sought for our abandoned sphere. The noise of the mooncalves would at times be a vast, flat, calf-like sound. At times it rose to an amazed and wrathy bellowing, and again it would become a clogged, bestial sound, as though these unseen creatures had sought to eat and bellow at the same time. Our first view was but an inadequate transitory glimpse, yet none the less disturbing because it was incomplete. Cavor was crawling in front at the time, and he first was aware of their proximity. He stopped dead, arresting me with a single gesture. A crackling and smashing of the scrub appeared to be advancing directly upon us, and then, as we squatted close and endeavored to judge of the nearness and direction of this noise, there came a terrific bellow behind us, so close and vehement that the tops of the bayonet scrub bent before it, and one felt the breath of it hot and moist. And, turning about, we saw indistinctly through a crowd of swaying stems the mooncalf's shining sides, and the long line of its back loomed out against the sky. Of course, it is hard for me now to say how much I saw at that time, because my impressions were corrected by subsequent observation. First of all impressions was its enormous size. The girth of its body was some 80 feet, its length perhaps 200. Its sides rose and fell with its labored breathing. I perceived that its gigantic flabby body lay along the ground, and that its skin was of a corrugated white, dappling into blackness along the backbone. But of its feet we saw nothing. I think also that we saw then the profile, at least of the almost brainless head, with its fat encumbered neck, its slobbering omnivorous mouth, its little nostrils, and tight-shut eyes. For the mooncalf invariably shuts its eyes in the presence of the sun. We had a glimpse of a vast red pit as it opened its mouth to bleat and bellow again. We had a breath from the pit, and then the monster heeled over like a ship, dragged forward along the ground, creasing all its leathery skin, rolled again, and so wallowed past us, smashing a path amidst the scrub, and was speedily hidden from our eyes by the dense interlacings beyond. Another appeared more distantly, and then another, and then, as though he was guiding these animated lumps of provender to their pasture, a Selenite came momentarily into ken. My grip upon Cavor's foot became convulsive at the sight of him, and we remained motionless and peering long after he had passed out of our range. By contrast with the mooncalves, he seemed a trivial being, a mere ant, scarcely 5 feet high. He was wearing garments of some leathery substance, so that no portion of his actual body appeared, but of this, of course, we were entirely ignorant. He presented himself, therefore, as a compact, bristling creature, having much of the quality of a complicated insect, with whip-like tentacles and a clanging arm projecting from his shining cylindrical body case. The form of his head was hidden by his enormous, many-spiked helmet. We discovered afterwards that he used the spikes for prodding refractory mooncalves. And a pair of goggles of darkened glass, set very much at the side, gave a bird-like quality to the metallic apparatus that covered his face. His arms did not project beyond his body case, and he carried himself upon short legs that, wrapped though they were in warm coverings, seemed to our terrestrial eyes inordinately flimsy. They had very short thighs, very long shanks, and little feet. In spite of his heavy-looking clothing, he was progressing with what would be, from the terrestrial point of view, very considerable strides, and his clanging arm was busy. The quality of his motion during the instant of his passing suggested haste and a certain anger, and soon after we had lost sight of him we heard the bellow of a mooncalf change abruptly into a short, sharp squeal, followed by the scuffle of its acceleration. And gradually that bellowing receded, and then came to an end, as if the pastures sought had been attained. We listened. For a space the moon world was still, but it was some time before we resumed our crawling search for the vanished sphere. When next we saw mooncalves, they were some little distance away from us in a place of tumbled rocks. The less vertical surfaces of the rocks were thick with a speckled green plant, growing in dense mossy clumps, upon which these creatures were browsing. We stopped at the edge of the reeds amidst which we were crawling at the sight of them, peering out at them and looking round for a second glimpse of a Selenite. They lay against their food like stupendous slugs, huge, greasy hulls, eating greedily and noisily, with a sort of sobbing avidity. They seemed monsters of mere fatness, clumsy and overwhelmed to a degree that would make a Smithfield ox seem a model of agility. Their busy, writhing, chewing mouths, and eyes closed, together with the appetizing sound of their munching, made up an effect of animal enjoyment that was singularly stimulating to our empty frames. "Hogs," said Cavor with unusual passion. "Disgusting hogs!" And after one glare of angry envy, crawled off through the bushes to our right. I stayed long enough to see that the speckled plant was quite hopeless for human nourishment, then crawled after him, nibbling a quill of it between my teeth. Presently we were arrested again by the proximity of a Selenite, and this time we were able to observe him more exactly. Now we could see that the Selenite covering was indeed clothing, and not a sort of crustacean integument. He is quite similar in his costume to the former one we had glimpsed, except that ends of something like wadding were protruding from his neck, and he stood on a promontory of rock and moved his head this way and that, as though he was surveying the crater. We lay quite still, fearing to attract his attention if we moved, and after a time he turned about and disappeared. We came upon another drove of mooncalves bellowing up a ravine, and then we passed over a place of sounds of beating machinery, as if some huge hall of industry came near the surface there. And while these sounds were still about us we came to the edge of a great open space, perhaps 200 yards in diameter and perfectly level. Save for a few lichens that advanced from its margin, this space was bare, and presented a powdery surface of a dusty yellow color. We were afraid to strike out across this space, but as it presented less obstruction to our crawling than the scrub, we went down upon it and began very circumspectly to skirt its edge. For a little while the noises from below ceased, and everything, save for the faint stir of the growing vegetation, was very still. Then abruptly there began an uproar, louder, more vehement, and nearer than any we had so far heard. Of a certainty it came from below. Instinctively we crouched as flat as we could, ready for a prompt plunge into the thicket beside us. Each knock and throb seemed to vibrate through our bodies. Louder grew this throbbing and beating, and that irregular vibration increased until the whole moon world seemed to be jerking and pulsing. "Cover!" whispered Cavor, and I turned towards the bushes. At that instant came a thud like the thud of a gun, and then a thing happened. It still haunts me in my dreams. I had turned my head to look at Cavor's face, and thrust out my hand in front of me as I did so, and my hand met nothing. I plunged suddenly into a bottomless hole. My chest hit something hard, and I found myself with my chin on the edge of an unfathomable abyss that had suddenly opened beneath me, my hand extended stiffly into the void. The whole of that flat circular area was no more than a gigantic lid that was now sliding sideways from off the pit it had covered into a slot prepared for it. Had it not been for Cavor, I think I should have remained rigid, hanging over this margin and staring into the enormous gulf below, until at last the edges of the slot scraped me off and hurled me into its depths. But Cavor had not received the shock that had paralyzed me. He had been a little distance from the edge when the lid had first opened, and perceiving the peril that held me helpless, gripped my legs and pulled me backwards. I came into a sitting position, crawled away from the edge for a space on all fours, then staggered up and ran after him across the thundering, quivering sheet of metal. It seemed to be swinging open with a steadily accelerated velocity, and the bushes in front of me shifted sideways as I ran. I was none too soon. Cavor's back vanished amidst the bristling thicket, and as I scrambled up after him, the monstrous valve came into its position with a clang. For a long time we lay panting, not daring to approach the pit. But at last, very cautiously, and bit by bit, we crept into a position from which we could peer down. The bushes about us creaked and swayed with the force of a breeze that was blowing down the shaft. We could see nothing at first except smooth vertical walls descending at last into an impenetrable black. And then, very gradually, we became aware of a number of very faint and little lights going to and fro. For a time that stupendous gulf of mystery held us so that we forgot even our sphere. In time, as we grew more accustomed to the darkness, we could make out very small, dim, elusive shapes moving about among those needlepoint illuminations. We peered amazed and incredulous, understanding so little that we could find no words to say. We could distinguish nothing that would give us a clue to the meaning of the faint shapes we saw. "What can it be?" I asked. "What can it be?" "The engineering. They must live in these caverns during the night and come out during the day." "Cavor," I said, "can they be that it was something like men?" "That was not a man." "We dare risk nothing." "We dare do nothing until we find the sphere." "We can do nothing until we find the sphere." He assented with a groan, and stirred himself to move. He stared about him for a space, sighed, and indicated a direction. We struck out through the jungle. For a time we crawled resolutely, then with diminishing vigor. Presently among great shapes of flabby purple there came a noise of trampling and cries about us. We lay close, and for a long time the sounds went to and fro, and very near. But this time we saw nothing. I tried to whisper to Cavor that I could hardly go without food much longer, but my mouth had become too dry for whispering. "Cavor," I said, "I must have food." He turned a face full of dismay towards me. "It's a case for holding out," he said. "But I must," I said, "and look at my lips. I've been thirsty some time." "If only some of that snow had remained." "It's clean gone. We're driving from Arctic to tropical at the rate of a degree a minute." I gnawed my hand. "The sphere," he said. "There is nothing for it but the sphere." We roused ourselves to another spurt of crawling. My mind ran entirely on edible things, on the hissing profundity of summer drinks. More particularly, I craved for beer. I was haunted by the memory of a 16-gallon cask that had swaggered in my Lympne cellar. I thought of the adjacent larder, and especially of steak and kidney pie. Tender steak and plenty of kidney, and rich, thick gravy between. Ever and again I was seized with fits of hungry yawning. We came to flat places overgrown with fleshy red things, monstrous coralline growths. As we pushed against them they snapped and broke. I noted the quality of the broken surfaces. The confounded stuff certainly looked of a biteable texture. Then it seemed to me that it smelt rather well. I picked up a fragment and sniffed at it. "Cavor," I said in a hoarse undertone. He glanced at me with his face screwed up. "Don't," he said. I put down the fragment, and we crawled on through this tempting fleshiness for a space. "Cavor?" I asked. "Why not?" "Poison," I heard him say, but he did not look round. We crawled some way before I decided. "I'll chance it," said I. He made a belated gesture to prevent me. I stuffed my mouth full. He crouched watching my face, his own twisted into the oddest expression. "It's good," I said. "Oh, Lord!" he cried. He watched me munch, his face wrinkled between desire and disapproval, then suddenly succumbed to appetite and began to tear off huge mouthfuls. For a time we did nothing but eat. The stuff was not unlike a terrestrial mushroom, only it was much laxer in texture, and as one swallowed it, it warmed the throat. At first we experienced a mere mechanical satisfaction in eating. Then our blood began to run warmer, and we tingled at the lips and fingers, and then new and slightly irrelevant ideas came bubbling up in our minds. "It's good," said I. "Infernally good. What a home for our surplus population, our poor surplus population." And I broke off another large portion. It filled me with a curiously benevolent satisfaction that there was such good food in the moon. The depression of my hunger gave way to an irrational exhilaration. The dread and discomfort in which I had been living vanished entirely. I perceived the moon no longer as a planet from which I most earnestly desired the means of escape, but as a possible refuge from human destitution. I think I forgot the Selenites, the mooncalves, the lid, and the noises completely so soon as I had eaten that fungus. Cavor replied to my third repetition of my surplus population remark with similar words of approval. I felt that my head swam, but I put this down to the stimulating effect of food after a long fast. "Excellent discovery, yours, Cavor," said I. "Second only to the Theta." "What d'yer mean?" asked Cavor. "Discovery of the moon, second only to the Theta." I looked at him, shocked at his suddenly hoarse voice and by the badness of his articulation. It occurred to me in a flash that he was intoxicated, possibly by the fungus. It also occurred to me that he erred in imagining that he had discovered the moon. He had not discovered it, he had only reached it. I tried to lay my hand on his arm and explain this to him, but the issue was too subtle for his brain. It was also unexpectedly difficult to express. After a momentary attempt to understand me, I remember wondering if the fungus had made my eyes as fishy as his, he set off upon some observations on his own account. "We are," he announced with a solemn hiccup, "the creatures of what we eat and drink." He repeated this, and as I was now in one of my subtle moods, I determined to dispute it. Possibly I wandered a little from the point, but Cavor certainly did not attend at all properly. He stood up as well as he could, putting a hand on my head to steady himself, which was disrespectful, and stood staring about him, quite devoid now of any fear of the moon beings. I tried to point out that this was dangerous for some reason that was not perfectly clear to me, but the word dangerous had somehow got mixed with indiscreet, and came out rather more like injurious than either, and after an attempt to disentangle them, I resumed my argument, addressing myself principally to the unfamiliar but attentive coralline growths on either side. I felt that it was necessary to clear up this confusion between the moon and a potato at once. I wandered into a long parenthesis on the importance of precision of definition in argument. I did my best to ignore the fact that my bodily sensations were no longer agreeable. In some way that I have now forgotten, my mind was led back to projects of colonization. "We must annex this moon," I said. "There must be no shilly-shally. This is part of the white man's burthen. Cavor, we are means satraps. N'Empire Caesar never dreamt. Been all the newspapers. Cavaritia. Bedfordshire, limited. Mean unlimited, practically. Certainly I was intoxicated. I embarked upon an argument to show the infinite benefits our arrival would confer on the moon. I involved myself in a rather difficult proof that the arrival of Columbus was, on the whole, beneficial to America. I found I had forgotten the line of argument I had intended to pursue, and continued to repeat, "similar to Columbus," to fill up time. From that point my memory of the action of that abominable fungus becomes confused. I remember vaguely that we declared our intention of standing no nonsense from any confounded insects, that we decided it ill became men to hide shamefully upon a mere satellite, that we equipped ourselves with huge armfuls of the fungus, whether for missile purposes or not I do not know, and heedless of the stabs of the bayonet scrub we started forth into the sunshine. Almost immediately we must have come upon the Selenites. There were 6 of them, and they were marching in single file over a rocky place, making the most remarkable piping and whining sounds. They all seemed to become aware of us at once. All instantly became silent and motionless, like animals, with their faces turned toward us. For a moment I was sobered. "Insects," murmured Cavor. "Insects. And they think I'm going to crawl about on my stomach, on my vertebrated stomach." "Stomach," he repeated slowly, as though he chewed the indignity. Then suddenly, with a sort of fury, he made 3 vast strides and leaped towards them. He leaped badly. He made a series of somersaults in the air, whirled right over them, and vanished with an enormous splash amidst the cactus bladders. What the Selenites made of this amazing, and to my mind undignified eruption from another planet, I have no means of guessing. I seem to remember the sight of their backs as they ran in all directions, but I am not sure. All these last incidents before oblivion came are vague and faint in my mind. I know I made a step to follow Cavor, and tripped and fell headlong among the rocks. I was, I am certain, suddenly and vehemently ill. I seem to remember a violent struggle and being gripped by metallic clasps. My next clear recollection is that we were prisoners at we knew not what depths beneath the moon's surface. We were in darkness, amidst strange, distracting noises. Our bodies were covered with scratches and bruises, and our heads racked with pain. End of chapter. Chapter 12. The Selenite's Face. I found myself sitting crouched together in a tumultuous darkness. For a long time I could not understand where I was, nor how I had come to this perplexity. I thought of the cupboard into which I had been thrust at times when I was a child, and then of a very dark and noisy bedroom in which I had slept during an illness. But these sounds about me were not the noises I had known, and there was a thin flavor in the air like the wind of a stable. Then I supposed we must still be at work upon the sphere, and that somehow I had got into the cellar of Cavor's house. I remembered we had finished the sphere, and fancied I must still be in it and travelling through space. "Cavor," I said, "cannot we have some light?" There came no answer. "Cavor," I insisted. I was answered by a groan. "My head," I heard him say. "My head." I attempted to press my hands to my brow, which ached, and discovered they were tied together. This startled me very much. I brought them up to my mouth and felt the cold smoothness of metal. They were chained together. I tried to separate my legs and made out that they were similarly fastened, and also that I was fastened to the ground by a much thicker chain about the middle of my body. I was more frightened than I had yet been by anything in all our strange experiences. For a time I tugged silently at my bonds. "Cavor!" I cried out sharply. "Why am I tied? Why have you tied me hand and foot?" "I haven't tied you," he answered. "It's the Selenites." The Selenites! My mind hung on that for a space. Then my memories came back to me. The snowy desolation, the thawing of the air, the growth of the plants, our strange hopping and crawling among the rocks and vegetation of the crater, all the distress of our frantic search for the sphere returned to me. Finally, the opening of the great lid that covered the pit. Then, as I strained to trace our later movements down to our present plight, the pain in my head became intolerable. I came to an insurmountable barrier, an obstinate blank. "Cavor!" "Yes." "Where are we?"
"How should I know?"
"Are we dead?"
"What nonsense!"
"They've got us, then." He made no answer but a grunt. The lingering traces of the poison seemed to make him oddly irritable. "What do you mean to do?"
"How should I know what to do?"
"Oh, very well," said I, and became silent. Presently I was roused from a stupor. "Oh, Lord!" I cried. "I wish you'd stop that buzzing." We lapsed into silence again, listening to the dull confusion of noises like the muffled sounds of a street or factory that filled our ears. I could make nothing of it. My mind pursued first one rhythm and then another, and questioned it in vain. But after a long time I became aware of a new and sharper element, not mingling with the rest but standing out, as it were, against that cloudy background of sound. It was a series of relatively very little definite sounds, tappings and rubbings, like a loose spray of ivy against a window, or a bird moving about upon a box. We listened and peered about us, but the darkness was a velvet pall. There followed a noise like the subtle movement of the wards of a well-oiled lock. And then there appeared before me, hanging as it seemed in an immensity of black, a thin bright line. "Look," whispered Cavor very softly.
"What is it?"
"I don't know." We stared. The thin, bright line became a band, and broader and paler. It took upon itself the quality of a bluish light falling upon a whitewashed wall. It ceased to be parallel-sided. It developed a deep indentation on one side. I turned to remark this to Cavor, and was amazed to see his ear in a brilliant illumination, all the rest of him in shadow. I twisted my head round as well as my bonds would permit. "Cavor," I said, "it's behind." His ear vanished, gave place to an eye. Suddenly the crack that had been emitting the light broadened out, and revealed itself as the space of an opening door. Beyond was a sapphire vista, and in the doorway stood a grotesque outline silhouetted against the glare. We both made convulsive efforts to turn, and failing, sat staring over our shoulders at this. My first impression was of some clumsy quadruped with lowered head. Then I perceived it was the slender, pinched body and short and extremely attenuated bandied legs of a Selenite, with his head depressed between his shoulders. He was without the helmet and body covering they wear upon the exterior. He was a blank, black figure to us, but instinctively our imaginations supplied features to his very human outline. I, at least, took it instantly that he was somewhat hunchbacked, with a high forehead and long features. He came forward 3 steps, and paused for a time. His movements seemed absolutely noiseless. Then he came forward again. He walked like a bird. His feet fell one in front of the other. He stepped out of the ray of light that came through the doorway, and it seemed as though he vanished altogether in the shadow. For a moment my eyes sought him in the wrong place, and then I perceived him standing facing us both in the full light. Only the human features I had attributed to him were not there at all. Of course I ought to have expected that, only I didn't. It came to me as an absolute, for a moment an overwhelming shock. It seemed as though it wasn't a face, as though it must needs be a mask, a horror, a deformity, that would presently be disavowed or explained. There was no nose, and the thing had dull, bulging eyes at the side. In the silhouette I had supposed they were ears. There were no ears. I have tried to draw one of these heads, but I cannot. There was a mouth, downwardly curved like a human mouth, and a face that stares ferociously. The neck on which the head was poised was jointed in 3 places, almost like the short joints in the leg of a crab. The joints of the limbs I could not see, because of the puttee-like straps in which they were swathed, and which formed the only clothing the being wore. There the thing was, looking at us. At the time my mind was taken up by the mad impossibility of the creature. I suppose he also was amazed, and with more reason, perhaps, for amazement than we. Only, confound him, he did not show it. He did at least know what had brought about this meeting of incompatible creatures. But conceive how it would seem to decent Londoners, for example, to come upon a couple of living things as big as men and absolutely unlike any other earthly animals, careering about among the sheep in Hyde Park. It must have taken him like that. Figure us. We were bound hand and foot, fagged and filthy, our beards 2 inches long, our faces scratched and bloody. Cavor you must imagine in his knickerbockers, torn in several places by the bayonet scrub, his Jaeger's shirt and old cricket cap, his wiry hair wildly disordered, a tail to every quarter of the heavens. In that blue light his face did not look red but very dark. His lips and the drying blood upon my hands seemed black. If possible I was in a worse plight than he, on account of the yellow fungus into which I had jumped. Our jackets were unbuttoned, and our shoes had been taken off and lay at our feet. And we were sitting with our backs to this queer, bluish light, peering at such a monster as Dürer might have invented. Cavor broke the silence, started to speak, went hoarse, and cleared his throat. Outside began a terrific bellowing, as if a mooncalf were in trouble. It ended in a shriek, and everything was still again. Presently the Selenite turned about, flickered into the shadow, stood for a moment retrospective at the door, and then closed it on us, and once more we were in that murmurous mystery of darkness into which we had awakened. End of chapter. Chapter 13. Mr. Cavor makes some suggestions. For a time neither of us spoke. To focus together all the things we had brought upon ourselves seemed beyond my mental powers. "They've got us," I said at last. "It was that fungus." "Well, if I hadn't eaten it we should have fainted and starved." "We might have found the sphere." I lost my temper at his persistence, and swore to myself. For a time we hated one another in silence. I drummed with my fingers on the floor between my knees, and gritted the links of my fetters together. Presently I was forced to talk again. "What do you make of it, anyhow?" I asked humbly. "They were reasonable creatures. They can make things and do things. Those lights we saw—" He stopped. It was clear he could make nothing of it. When he spoke again it was to confess, "After all, they are more human than we had a right to expect. I suppose—" He stopped irritatingly. "Yes?" "I suppose, anyhow, on any planet where there is an intelligent animal, it will carry its brain case upward, and have hands and walk erect." Presently he broke away in another direction. "We are some way in," he said. "I mean, perhaps a couple of 1,000 feet or more." "Why?" "It's cooler, and our voices are so much louder. That faded quality, it has altogether gone, and the feeling in one's ears and throat." I had not noted that, but I did now. "We must be some depths. A mile even we may be, inside the moon." "We never thought of a world inside the moon." "No." "How could we?" "We might have done,
Only one gets into habits of mind."
He thought for a time.
"Now," he said, "it seems such an obvious thing. Of course, the moon must be enormously cavernous, with an atmosphere within, and at the center of its caverns a sea. One knew that the moon had a lower specific gravity than the earth. One knew that it had little air or water outside. One knew, too, that it was sister planet to the earth, and that it was unaccountable that it should be different in composition. The inference that it was hollowed out was as clear as day, and yet one never saw it as a fact. Kepler, of course—" His voice had the interest now of a man who has discerned a pretty sequence of reasoning. "Yes," he said, "Kepler with his subvulvani was right after all."
"I wish you had taken the trouble to find that out before we came," I said. He answered nothing, buzzing to himself softly as he pursued his thoughts. My temper was going. "What do you think has become of the sphere, anyhow?" I asked.
"Lost,"
he said, like a man who answers an uninteresting question.
"Among those plants?" "Unless they find it."
"And then?"
"How can I tell?"
"Cavor," I said with a sort of hysterical bitterness, "things look bright for my company." He made no answer. "Good Lord!" I exclaimed. "Just think of all the trouble we took to get into this pickle. What did we come for? What are we after? What was the moon to us, or we to the moon? We wanted too much. We tried too much. We ought to have started the little things first. It was you proposed the moon. Those Cavorite spring blinds. I am certain we could have worked them for terrestrial purposes. Certain. Did you really understand what I proposed? A steel cylinder."
"Rubbish," said Cavor.
We ceased to converse. For a time Cavor kept up a broken monologue without much help from me.
"If they find it," he began, "if they find it, what will they do with it? Well, that's a question. It may be that's the question. They won't understand it anyhow. If they understood that sort of thing, they would have come long since to the earth."
"Would they?"
"Why shouldn't they? But they would have sent something. They couldn't keep their hands off such a possibility." "No. But they will examine it. Clearly they are intelligent and inquisitive. They will examine it, get inside it, trifle with the studs. Off! That would mean the moon for us for all the rest of our lives. Strange creatures, strange knowledge."
"As for strange knowledge," said I, and language failed me.
"Look here, Bedford," said Cavor. "You came on this expedition of your own free will."
"You said to me, call it prospecting."
"There's always risk in prospecting."
"Especially when you do it unarmed and without thinking out every possibility."
"I was so taken up with the sphere. The thing rushed on us and carried us away."
"Rushed on me, you mean."
"Rushed on me just as much. How was I to know when I set to work on molecular physics that the business would bring me here? Of all places."
"It's this accursed science," I cried. "It's the very devil. The medieval priests and persecutors were right, and the moderns are all wrong. You tamper with it, and it offers you gifts, and directly you take them it knocks you to pieces in some unexpected way. Old passions and new weapons. Now it upsets your religion. Now it upsets your social ideas. Now it whirls you off to desolation and misery."
"Anyhow, it's no use your quarreling with me now. These creatures, these Selenites, or whatever we choose to call them, have got us tied hand and foot. Whatever temper you choose to go through with it in, you will have to go through with it. We have experiences before us that will need all our coolness."
He paused as if he required my assent, But I sat sulking. "Confound your science," I said.
The problem is communication. Gestures, I fear, will be different. Pointing, for example. No creatures but men and monkeys point.
That was too obviously wrong for me. "Pretty nearly every animal," I cried, "points with its eyes or nose." Cavor meditated over that.
"Yes," he said at last, "and we don't. There's such differences, such differences. One might, but how can I tell? There is speech, the sounds they make, a sort of fluting and piping. I don't see how we are to imitate that. Is it their speech, that sort of thing? They may have different senses, different means of communication. Of course they are minds, and we are minds. There must be something in common. Who knows how far we may not get to an understanding?"
"The things are outside us," I said. "They're more different from us than the strangest animals on earth. They are a different clay. What is the good of talking like this?"
Cavor thought. "I don't see that. Where there are minds they will have something similar, even though they have been evolved on different planets. Of course, if it was a question of instincts, if we or they are no more than animals—"
"Well, are they? They're much more like ants on their hind legs than human beings, and who ever got to any sort of understanding with ants?"
"But these machines and clothing. No, I don't hold with you, Bedford. The difference is wide."
"It's insurmountable."
"The resemblance must bridge it. I remember reading once a paper by the late Professor Galton on the possibility of communication between the planets. Unhappily, at that time it did not seem probable that that would be of any material benefit to me, and I fear I did not give it the attention I should have done, in view of this state of affairs. Yet, now, let me see. His idea was to begin with those broad truths that must underlie all conceivable mental existences, and establish a basis on those. The great principles of geometry, to begin with. He proposed to take some leading proposition of Euclid's, and show by construction that its truth was known to us, to demonstrate, for example, that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, and that if the equal sides be produced, the angles on the other side of the base are equal also. Or that the square on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the two other sides. By demonstrating our knowledge of these things, we should demonstrate our possession of a reasonable intelligence. Now, suppose I might draw the geometrical figure with a wet finger, or even trace it in the air." We fell silent. I sat meditating his words. For a time his wild hope of communication, of interpretation, with these weird beings held me. Then that angry despair that was a part of my exhaustion and physical misery resumed its sway. I perceived with a sudden, novel vividness the extraordinary folly of everything I had ever done. "Ass," I said. "Oh, ass! Unutterable ass! I seem to exist only to go about doing preposterous things. Why did we ever leave the thing? Hopping about looking for patents and concessions in the craters of the moon. If only we had had the sense to fasten a handkerchief to a stick to show where we had left the sphere." I subsided, fuming. "It is clear," meditated Cavor. "They are intelligent. One can hypothecate certain things. As they have not killed us at once, they must have ideas of mercy. Mercy! At any rate of restraint, possibly of intercourse. They may meet us. And this apartment, and the glimpses we had of its guardian. These fetters, a high degree of intelligence."
"I wish to heaven," cried I, "I'd thought even twice. Plunge after plunge, first one fluky start, and then another. It was my confidence in you. Why didn't I stick to my play? That was what I was equal to. That was my world and the life I was made for. I could have finished that play. I'm certain it was a good play. I had the scenario as good as done. Then, conceive it, leaping to the moon. Practically, I've thrown my life away. That old woman in the inn near Canterbury had better sense. I looked up and stopped in mid-sentence. The darkness had given place to that bluish light again. The door was opening, and several noiseless Selenites were coming into the chamber. I became quite still, staring at their grotesque faces. Then suddenly my sense of disagreeable strangeness changed to interest. I perceived that the foremost and second carried bowls. One elemental need at least our minds could understand in common. They were bowls of some metal that, like our fetters, looked dark in that bluish light, and each contained a number of whitish fragments. All the cloudy pain and misery that oppressed me rushed together and took the shape of hunger. I eyed those bowls wolfishly, and though it returned to me in dreams, at that time it seemed a small matter that at the end of the arms that lowered one towards me were not hands, but a sort of flap and thumb, like the end of an elephant's trunk. The stuff in the bowl was loose in texture, and whitish-brown in color, rather like lumps of some cold souffle, and it smelt faintly like mushrooms. From a partially divided carcass of a mooncalf that we presently saw, I am inclined to believe it must have been mooncalf flesh. My hands were so tightly chained that I could barely contrive to reach the bowl, but when they saw the effort I made, two of them dexterously released one of the turns about my wrist. Their tentacle hands were soft and cold to my skin. I immediately seized a mouthful of the food. It had the same laxness and texture that all organic structures seem to have upon the moon. It tasted rather like a gaufre or a damp meringue, but in no way was it disagreeable. I took two other mouthfuls. "I wanted food," said I, tearing off a still larger piece. For a time we ate with an utter absence of self-consciousness. We ate, and presently drank like tramps in a soup kitchen. Never before nor since have I been hungry to the ravenous pitch, and save that I have had this very experience, I could never have believed that, 250,000 of miles out of our proper world, in utter perplexity of soul, surrounded, watched, touched by beings more grotesque and inhuman than the worst creations of a nightmare, it would be possible for me to eat in utter forgetfulness of all these things. They stood about us watching us, and ever and again making a slight elusive twittering that stood the suppose in the stead of speech. I did not even shiver at their touch, and when the first zeal of my feeding was over, I could note that Cavor, too, had been eating with the same shameless abandon. End of chapter. Chapter 14. Experiments in Intercourse. When at last we had made an end of eating, the Selenites linked our hands closely together again, and then untwisted the chains about our feet and rebound them, so as to give us a limited freedom of movement. Then they unfastened the chains about our waists. To do all this they had to handle us freely, and ever and again one of their queer heads came down close to my face, or a soft tentacle hand touched my head or neck. I don't remember that I was afraid then or repelled by their proximity. I think that our incurable anthropomorphism made us imagine they were human heads inside their masks. The skin, like everything else, looked bluish, but that was on account of the light, and it was hard and shiny, quite in the beetle wing fashion, not soft or moist or hairy, as a vertebrated animal's would be. Along the crest of the head was a low ridge of whitish spines running from back to front, and a much larger ridge curved on either side over the eyes. The Selenite who untied me used his mouth to help his hands. "They seem to be releasing us," said Cavor. "Remember, we are on the moon. Make no sudden movements." "Are you going to try that geometry?" "If I get a chance.
but of course they may make an advance first." We remained passive, and the Selenites, having finished their arrangements, stood back from us and seemed to be looking at us. I say seemed to be, because as their eyes were at the side, and not in front, one had the same difficulty in determining the direction in which they were looking as one has in the case of a hen or a fish. They conversed with one another in their reedy tones that seemed to me impossible to imitate or define. The door behind us opened wider, and, glancing over my shoulder, I saw a vague large space beyond, in which quite a little crowd of Selenites were standing. They seemed a curiously miscellaneous rabble. "Do they want us to imitate those sounds?" I asked Cavor. "I don't think so," he said. "It seems to me that they are trying to make us understand something." "I can't make anything of their gestures. Do you notice this one, who is worrying with his head like a man with an uncomfortable collar?" "Let us shake our heads at him." We did that, and finding it ineffectual, attempted an imitation of the Selenites' movements. That seemed to interest them. At any rate, they all set up the same movement. But as that seemed to lead to nothing, we desisted at last, and so did they, and fell into a piping argument among themselves. Then one of them, shorter and very much thicker than the others, and with a particularly wide mouth, squatted down suddenly beside Cavor, and put his hands and feet in the same posture as Cavor's were bound, and then by a dexterous movement stood up. "Cavor!" I shouted. "They want us to get up!" He stared open-mouthed. "That's it," he said. And with much heaving and grunting, because our hands were tied together, we contrived to struggle to our feet. The Selenites made way for our elephantine heavings, and seemed to twitter more volubly. As soon as we were on our feet, the thick-set Selenite came and patted each of our faces with his tentacles, and walked towards the open doorway. That also was plain enough, and we followed him. We saw that 4 of the Selenites standing in the doorway were much taller than the others, and clothed in the same manner as those we had seen in the crater, namely, with spiked round helmets and cylindrical body cases, and that each of the 4 carried a goad with spike and guard made of that same dull-looking metal as the bowls. These 4 closed about us, one on either side of each of us, as we emerged from our chamber into the cavern from which the light had come. We did not get our impression of that cavern all at once. Our attention was taken up by the movements and attitudes of the Selenites immediately about us, and by the necessity of controlling our motion, lest we should startle and alarm them, and ourselves, by some excessive stride. In front of us was the short, thick-set being who had solved the problem of asking us to get up, moving with gestures that seemed, almost all of them, intelligible to us, inviting us to follow him. His spout-like face turned from one of us to the other with a quickness that was clearly interrogative. For a time, I say, we were taken up with these things. But at last the great place that formed a background to our movements asserted itself. It became apparent that the source of such, at least, of the tumult of sounds which had filled our ears ever since we had recovered from the stupefaction of the fungus, was a vast mass of machinery in active movement, whose flying and whirling parts were visible indistinctly over the heads and between the bodies of the Selenites who walked about us. And not only did the web of sounds that filled the air proceed from this mechanism, but also the peculiar blue light that irradiated the whole place. We had taken it as a natural thing that a subterranean cavern should be artificially lit, and even now, though the fact was patent to my eyes, I did not really grasp its import until presently the darkness came. The meaning and structure of this huge apparatus we saw I cannot explain, because we neither of us learnt what it was for, or how it worked. One after another, big shafts of metal flung out and up from its center, their heads traveling in what seemed to me to be a parabolic path. Each dropped a sort of dangling arm as it rose towards the apex of its flight,
and plunged down into a vertical cylinder, forcing this down before it. About it moved the shapes of tenders, little figures that seemed vaguely different from the beings about us. As each of the 3 dangling arms of the machine plunged down, there was a clank and then a roaring, and out of the top of the vertical cylinder came pouring this incandescent substance that lit the place, and ran over as milk runs over a boiling pot, and dripped luminously into a tank of light below. It was a cold blue light, a sort of phosphorescent glow, but infinitely brighter, and from the tanks into which it fell it ran in conduits athwart the cavern. Thud, 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 thud came the sweeping arms of this unintelligible apparatus, and the light substance hissed and poured. At first the thing seemed only reasonably large and near to us, and then I saw how exceedingly little the Selenites upon it seemed, and I realized the full immensity of cavern and machine. I looked from this tremendous affair to the faces of the Selenites with a new respect. I stopped, and Cavor stopped, and stared at this thunderous engine. "But this is stupendous," I said. "What can it be for?" Cavor's blue-lit face was full of an intelligent respect. "I can't dream. Surely these beings... Men could not make a thing like that. Look at those arms. Are they on connecting rods?" The thick-set Selenite had gone some paces unheeded. He came back and stood between us and the great machine. I avoided seeing him because I had guessed somehow that his idea was to beckon us onward. He walked away in the direction he wished us to go, and turned and came back, and flicked our faces to attract our attention. Cavor and I looked at one another. "Cannot we show him we are interested in the machine?" I said. "Yes," said Cavor, "we'll try that." He turned to our guide and smiled, and pointed to the machine, and pointed again, and then to his head, and then to the machine. By some defect of reasoning he seemed to imagine that broken English might help these gestures. "Me look 'em," he said. "Me think 'em very much. Yes." His behavior seemed to check the Selenites in their desire for our progress for a moment. They faced one another, their queer heads moved, the twittering voices came thick and liquid. Then one of them, a lean, tall creature, with a sort of mantle added to the puttee in which the others were dressed, twisted his elephant trunk of a hand about Cavor's waist and pulled him gently to follow our guide, who again went on ahead. Cavor resisted. "We may just as well begin explaining ourselves now. They may think we are new animals, a new sort of mooncalf, perhaps. It is most important that we should show an intelligent interest from the outset." He began to shake his head violently. "No, no," he said. "Me not come on 1 minute. Me look at 'em." "Isn't there some geometrical point you might bring in apropos of that affair?" I suggested as the Selenites conferred again. "Possibly a parabolic," he began. He yelled loudly and leaped 6 feet or more. One of the 4 armed moon men had pricked him with a goad. I turned on the goad-bearer behind me with a swift, threatening gesture, and he started back. This and Cavor's sudden shouting leap clearly astonished all the Selenites. They receded hastily, facing us. For one of those moments that seemed to last forever, we stood in angry protest, with a scattered semicircle of these inhuman beings about us. "He pricked me," said Cavor with a catching of the voice. "I saw him," I answered. "Confound it," I said to the Selenites. "We're not going to stand that. What on earth do you take us for?" I glanced quickly right and left. Far away across the blue wilderness of cavern I saw a number of other Selenites running towards us. Broad and slender they were, and one with a larger head than the others. The cavern spread wide and low, and receded in every direction into darkness. Its roof, I remember, seemed to bulge down, as if with the weight of the vast thickness of rocks that prisoned us. There was no way out of it, no way out of it. Above, below, in every direction was the unknown, and these inhuman creatures, with goads and gestures, confronting us, and we two unsupported men. Chapter 15. The Giddy Bridge. Just for a moment that hostile pause endured. I suppose that both we and the Selenites did some very rapid thinking. My clearest impression was that there was nothing to put my back against, and that we were bound to be surrounded and killed. The overwhelming folly of our presence there loomed over me in black, enormous reproach. Why had I ever launched myself on this mad, inhuman expedition? Cavor came to my side and laid his hand on my arm. His pale and terrified face was ghastly in the blue light. "We can't do anything," he said. "It's a mistake. They don't understand. We must go, as they want us to go." I looked down at him, and then at the fresh Selenites who were coming to help their fellows. "If I had my hands free—" "It's no use," he panted. "No." "We'll go." And he turned about and led the way in the direction that had been indicated for us. I followed, trying to look as subdued as possible, and feeling at the chains about my wrists. My blood was boiling. I noted nothing more of that cavern, though it seemed to take a long time before we had marched across it, or if I noted anything I forgot it as I saw it. My thoughts were concentrated, I think, upon my chains and the Selenites, and particularly upon the helmeted ones with the goads. At first they marched parallel with us and at a respectful distance, but presently they were overtaken by 3 others, and then they drew nearer, until they were within arm's length again. I winced like a beaten horse as they came near to us. The shorter, thicker Selenite marched at first on our right flank, but presently came in front of us again. How well the picture of that grouping has bitten into my brain! The back of Cavor's downcast head, just in front of me, and the dejected droop of his shoulders, and our guide's gaping visage, perpetually jerking about him, and the goad-bearers on either side, watchful, yet open-mouthed, a blue monochrome. And after all, I do remember one other thing besides the purely personal affair, which is, that a sort of gutter came presently across the floor of the cavern, and then ran along by the side of the path of rock we followed, and it was full of that same bright blue luminous stuff that flowed out of the great machine. I walked close beside it, and I can testify it radiated not a particle of heat. It was brightly shining, and yet it was neither warmer nor colder than anything else in the cavern. Clang, clang, clang! We passed right under the thumping levers of another vast machine, and so came at last to a wide tunnel, in which we could even hear the pad, pad of our shoeless feet, and which, save for the trickling thread of blue to the right of us, was quite unlit. The shadows made gigantic travesties of our shapes and those of the Selenites on the irregular wall and roof of the tunnel. Ever and again crystals in the walls of the tunnel scintillated like gems. Ever and again the tunnel expanded into a stalactitic cavern, or gave off branches that vanished into darkness. We seemed to be marching down that tunnel for a long time. Trickle, trickle, went the flowing light very softly, and our footfalls and their echoes made an irregular paddle, paddle. My mind settled down to the question of my chains. If I were to slip off one turn, so, and then to twist it, so. If I tried to do it very gradually, would they see I was slipping my wrist out of the looser turn? If they did, what would they do? "Bedford," said Cavor, "it goes down. It keeps on going down." His remark roused me from my sullen preoccupation. "If they wanted to kill us," he said, dropping back to come level with me, "there is no reason why they should not have done it." "No," I admitted, "that's true." "They don't understand us," he said.
They think we are merely strange animals, some wild sort of mooncalf birth, perhaps. It will be only when they have observed us better that they will begin to think we have minds." "When you trace those geometrical problems," said I. "It may be that." We tramped on for a space. "You see," said Cavor, "these may be Selenites of a lower class." "The infernal fools!" said I viciously, glancing at their exasperating faces. "If we endure what they do to us—" "We've got to endure it," said I. "There may be others less stupid. This is the mere outer fringe of their world. It must go down and down, cavern, passage, tunnel, down at last to the sea, hundreds of miles below." His words made me think of the mile or so of rock and tunnel that might be over our heads already. It was like a weight dropping on my shoulders. "Away from the sun and air," I said. "Even a mine half a mile deep is stuffy," I remarked. "This is not anyhow. It's probable ventilation. The air would blow from the dark side of the moon to the sunlit, and all the carbonic acid would well out there and feed those plants. Up this tunnel, for example, there is quite a breeze. And what a world it must be! The earnest we have in that shaft, and those machines—" "And the goad," I said. "Don't forget the goad." He walked a little in front of me for a time. "Even that goad," he said. "Well?" "I was angry at the time, but it was perhaps necessary we should get on. They have different skins and probably different nerves. They may not understand our objection, just as a being from Mars might not like our earthly habit of nudging." "They'd better be careful how they nudge me." "And about that geometry. After all, their way is a way of understanding, too. They begin with the elements of life and not of thought. Food, compulsion, pain. They strike at fundamentals." "There's no doubt about that," I said. He went on to talk of the enormous and wonderful world into which we were being taken. I realized slowly from his tone that even now he was not absolutely in despair at the prospect of going ever deeper into this inhuman planet burrow. His mind ran on machines and invention, to the exclusion of 1,000 dark things that beset me. It wasn't that he intended to make any use of these things, he simply wanted to know them. "After all," he said, "this is a tremendous occasion. It is the meeting of two worlds. What are we going to see? Think of what is below us here." "We shan't see much if the light isn't better," I remarked. "This is only the outer crust. Down below, on this scale, there will be everything. Do you notice how different they seem one from another? The story we shall take back." "Some rare sort of animal," I said, "might comfort himself in that way while they were bringing him to the zoo. It doesn't follow that we are going to be shown all these things." "When they find we have reasonable minds," said Cavor, "they will want to learn about the earth. Even if they have no generous emotions, they will teach in order to learn. And the things they must know, the unanticipated things." He went on to speculate on the possibility of their knowing things he had never hoped to learn on earth, speculating in that way, with a raw wound from that goad already in his skin. Much that he said I forget, for my attention was drawn to the fact that the tunnel along which we had been marching was opening out wider and wider. We seemed, from the feeling of the air, to be going out into a huge space. But how big the space might really be we could not tell, because it was unlit. Our little stream of light ran in a dwindling thread and vanished far ahead. Presently the rocky walls had vanished altogether on either hand. There was nothing to be seen but the path in front of us and the trickling, hurrying rivulet of blue phosphorescence.
The figures of Cavor and the guiding Selenite marched before me. The sides of their legs and heads that were towards the rivulet were clear and bright blue. Their darkened sides, now that the reflection of the tunnel wall no longer lit them, merged indistinguishably in the darkness beyond. And soon I perceived that we were approaching a declivity of some sort, because the little blue stream dipped suddenly out of sight. In another moment, as it seemed, we had reached the edge. The shining stream gave one meander of hesitation, and then rushed over. It fell to a depth at which the sound of its descent was absolutely lost to us. Far below was a bluish glow, a sort of blue mist, at an infinite distance below, and the darkness the stream dropped out of became utterly void and black, save that a thing like a plank projected from the edge of the cliff and stretched out and faded and vanished altogether. There was a warm air blowing up out of the gulf. For a moment I and Cavor stood as near the edge as we dared, peering into a blue-tinged profundity, and then our guide was pulling at my arm. Then he left me and walked to the end of that plank and stepped upon it, looking back. Then when he perceived we watched him, he turned about and went on along it, walking as surely as though he was on firm earth. For a moment his form was indistinct, then he became a blue blur, and then vanished into the obscurity. I became aware of some vague shape looming darkly out of the black. There was a pause. "Surely," said Cavor. One of the other Selenites walked a few paces out upon the plank, and turned and looked back at us unconcernedly. The others stood ready to follow after us. Our guide's expectant figure reappeared. He was returning to see why we had not advanced. "What is that beyond there?" I asked. "I can't see." "We can't cross this at any price," said I. "I could not go 3 steps on it," said Cavor, "even with my hands free." We looked at each other's drawn faces in blank consternation. "They can't know what it is to be giddy," said Cavor. "It's quite impossible for us to walk that plank." "I don't believe they see as we do. I've been watching them. I wonder if they know this is simply blackness for us. How can we make them understand?" "Anyhow, we must make them understand." I think we said these things with a vague half-hope the Selenites might somehow understand. I knew quite clearly that all that was needed was an explanation. Then, as I saw their faces, I realized that an explanation was impossible. Just here it was that our resemblances were not going to bridge our differences. Well, I wasn't going to walk the plank anyhow. I slipped my wrist very quickly out of the coil of chain that was loose, and then began to twist my wrist in opposite directions. I was standing nearest to the bridge, and as I did this 2 of the Selenites laid hold of me and pulled me gently towards it. I shook my head violently. "No go," I said. "No use. You don't understand." Another Selenite added his compulsion. I was forced to step forward. "I've got an idea," said Cavor, but I knew his ideas. "Look here," I exclaimed to the Selenites. "Steady on. It's all very well for you." I sprang round upon my heel. I burst out into curses, for one of the armed Selenites had stabbed me behind with his goad. I wrenched my wrists free from the little tentacles that held them. I turned on the goad-bearer. "Confound you!" I cried. "I've warned you of that. What on earth do you think I'm made of, to stick that into me? If you touch me again—" By way of answer he pricked me forthwith. I heard Cavor's voice in alarm and entreaty. Even then I think he wanted to compromise with these creatures. "I say, Bedford," he cried, "I know a way." But the sting of that second stab seemed to set free some pent-up reserve of energy in my being. Instantly the link of the wrist chain snapped, and with it snapped all considerations that had held us unresisting in the hands of these moon creatures. For that second, at least, I was mad with fear and anger. I took no thought of consequences. I hit straight out at the face of the thing with the goad. The chain was twisted round my fist. There came another of those beastly surprises of which the moon world is full. My mailed hand seemed to go clean through him. He smashed like some softish sort of sweet with liquid in it. He broke right in. He squelched and splashed. It was like hitting a damp toadstool. The flimsy body went spinning a dozen yards and fell with a flabby impact. I was astonished. I was incredulous that any living thing could be so flimsy. For an instant I could have believed the whole thing a dream. Then it had become real and imminent again. Neither Cavor nor the other Selenites seemed to have done anything from the time when I had turned about to the time when the dead Selenite hit the ground. Every one stood back from us too, every one alert. That arrest seemed to last at least a second after the Selenite was down. Every one must have been taking the thing in. I seemed to remember myself standing with my arm half retracted, trying also to take it in. "What next?" clamoured my brain. "What next?" Then in a moment every one was moving. I perceived we must get our chains loose, and that before we could do this these Selenites had to be beaten off. I faced towards the group of the 3 goad-bearers. Instantly one threw his goad at me. It swished over my head, and I suppose went flying into the abyss behind. I leaped right at him with all my might as the goad flew over me. He turned to run as I jumped, and I bore him to the ground, came down right upon him, and slipped upon his smashed body and fell. He seemed to wriggle under my foot. I came into a sitting position, and on every hand the blue backs of the Selenites were receding into the darkness. I bent a link by main force, and untwisted the chain that had hampered me about the ankles, and sprang to my feet, with the chain in my hand. Another goad, flung javelin-wise, whistled by me, and I made a rush towards the darkness out of which it had come. Then I turned back towards Cavor, who was still standing in the light of the rivulet near the gulf, convulsively busy with his wrists, and at the same time jabbering nonsense about his idea. "Come on!" I cried. "My hands!" he answered. Then, realizing that I dared not run back to him, because my ill-calculated steps might carry me over the edge, he came shuffling towards me, with his hands held out before him. I gripped his chains at once to unfasten them. "Where are they?" he panted. "Run away. They'll come back. They're throwing things. Which way shall we go?" "By the light. To that tunnel, eh?" "Yes," said I, and his hands were free. I dropped on my knees and fell to work on his ankle bonds. Whack came something, I know not what, and splashed the livid streamlet into drops about us. Far away on our right a piping and whistling began. I whipped the chain off his feet and put it in his hand. "Hit with that," I said, and without waiting for an answer set off in big bounds along the path by which we had come. I had a nasty sort of feeling that these things could jump out of the darkness onto my back. I heard the impact of his leaps come following after me. We ran in vast strides, but that running, you must understand, was an altogether different thing from any running on earth. On earth one leaps and almost instantly hits the ground again, but on the moon, because of its weaker pull, one shot through the air for several seconds before one came to earth. In spite of our violent hurry, this gave an effect of long pauses, pauses in which one might have counted 7 or 8. Step, and one soared off. All sorts of questions ran through my mind. Where are the Selenites? What will they do? Shall we ever get to that tunnel? Is Cavor far behind? Are they likely to cut him off? Then whack, stride, and off again for another step. I saw a Selenite running in front of me, his legs going exactly as a man's would go on earth, saw him glance over his shoulder, and heard him shriek as he ran aside out of my way into the darkness. He was, I think, our guide, but I am not sure. Then in another vast stride the walls of rock had come into view on either hand, and in 2 more strides I was in the tunnel, and tempering my pace to its low roof. I went on to a bend, then stopped and turned back, and plug, 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 Cavor came into view, splashing into the stream of blue light at every stride, and grew larger and blundered into me. We stood clutching each other. For a moment, at least, we had shaken off our captors and were alone. We were both very much out of breath. We spoke in panting, broken sentences. "You've spoiled it all," panted Cavor. "Nonsense!" I cried. "It was that or death." "What are we to do?" "Hide." "How can we?" "It's dark enough." "But where?" "Up one of these side caverns." "And then?" "Think." "Right. Come on." We strode on, and presently came to a radiating dark cavern. Cavor was in front. He hesitated, and chose a black mouth that seemed to promise good hiding. He went towards it and turned. "It's dark," he said. "Your legs and feet will light us. You're wet with that luminous stuff." "But—" A tumult of sounds, and in particular a sound like a clanging gong, advancing up the main tunnel, became audible. It was horribly suggestive of a tumultuous pursuit. We made a bolt for the unlit side cavern forthwith. As we ran along it, our way was lit by the irradiation of Cavor's legs. "It's lucky," I panted, "they took off our boots, or we should fill this place with clatter." On we rushed, taking as small steps as we could to avoid striking the roof of the cavern. After a time we seemed to be gaining on the uproar. It became muffled, it dwindled, it died away. I stopped and looked back, and I heard the pad pad of Cavor's feet receding. Then he stopped also. "Bedford," he whispered, "there's a sort of light in front of us." I looked and at first could see nothing. Then I perceived his head and shoulders dimly outlined against a fainter darkness. I saw also that this mitigation of the darkness was not blue, as all the other light within the moon had been, but a pallid grey, a very vague, faint white, the daylight colour. Cavor noted this difference as soon or sooner than I did, and I think too that it filled him with much the same wild hope. "Bedford," he whispered, and his voice trembled. "That light! It is possible." He did not dare to say the thing he hoped. There came a pause. Suddenly I knew by the sound of his feet that he was striding toward that pallor. I followed him with a beating heart. End of chapter.